You read the message 3 times before you type anything back. Not because it's confusing, because it's short. Shorter than usual. And somewhere in the space between what they wrote and what they meant, you start looking for a reason. You do this in rooms too. You'll be sitting across from someone, half listening to what they're actually saying, while another part of you tracks something else entirely, the corner of their mouth, the pace of their breathing, whether they're still looking at you the way they were 5 minutes ago. You're not having one conversation, you're having 2, one out loud and one where you're checking. And later, alone, you'll replay a sentence you said an hour ago, turning it over, wondering if it landed wrong, wondering if there was a flicker, a half second where something shifted in their face, and you missed it because you weren't watching closely enough. It happens in group settings too, in a slightly different shape. You walk into a room where several people are already talking, and before you've said a word yourself, some part of you has already taken a reading of the whole space, who seems distracted, whose laugh sounded a little forced, whether the energy shifted the moment you walked in, or whether that's just something you're imagining because you're the one paying attention to it. You're not checking one face anymore, you're checking a room. Running the same monitoring process, just spread across more surfaces at once. Here's what's strange about all 3 of these. Nobody has told you anything is wrong. No one has confirmed there's a problem at all, and yet you are already checking, scanning, monitoring, cross-referencing for a problem that, as far as you actually know, does not exist yet. So what is it you're doing exactly when you do this? It isn't quite the same as paying attention to someone. Ordinary noticing tends to resolve. You notice something, you respond to it or file it away, and the noticing is finished. What you're describing behaves differently. It's continuous and it reopens. A reply comes in shorter than expected, and instead of reading it once and moving on, you read it again, checking the tone, checking whether the shortness means something or means nothing. And even after you've decided it probably means nothing, some part of you keeps the question open, filed, ready to be reopened the next time something else looks slightly off. You are treating another person's emotional state the way you treat an instrument reading. Something to be checked and checked again because it might have changed since the last time you looked, and because you can't actually see inside it, only the surface of it, which means no reading is ever quite final. There's an old figure in Greek myth built almost entirely out of this problem. Argus, sometimes called Argus Panoptes, the all-seeing, a many-eyed giant, given 100 eyes in Ovid's telling. Hera, suspicious of Zeus, gives Io, transformed into a heifer, into Argus's keeping. His task is simple: keep her under watch. What makes Argus useful for that isn't his strength, it's that not all of his eyes sleep at once. Some always stay open. He was built so that vigilance never fully switches off. It's a strange kind of custody when you look closely at it. Argus isn't holding her through force alone. He's holding her through never stopping the watching. And the story doesn't end with him overpowered in a fight. It ends with Hermes, sent to free her, doing something quieter than that. Hermes plays a slow tune on a reed pipe, settles in for a long conversation, and tells Argus the unhurried story of Syringe, patient enough that the telling itself starts to work on him. Eye by eye, the watching gives out until the last of them finally closes, and Hermes, with the help of a sleep-inducing wand, brings the long watch to its end. The myth isn't a diagnosis, and it isn't offered here as proof of anything about how a real mind works. But it's a useful shape for a real pattern, a kind of attention that isn't meant to rest, that treats a closed eye as a risk, that keeps some part of itself awake even when nothing is currently happening. And like Argus, this kind of watching can survive for a long time because it doesn't need evidence of danger to keep operating. It just needs the possibility of it. That possibility is doing more work in this pattern than most people notice. You are not checking because you have information that something is wrong. You are checking because you don't have information either way, and that not knowing is the thing your attention can't seem to leave alone. This is where the pattern starts to suggest something beyond concern for someone else, though the two aren't mutually exclusive. When checking continues after you've already gotten a clear, reassuring answer, when you can ask directly, hear a calm response, and still feel the pull to check again 10 minutes later, that persistence raises the possibility that gathering information isn't the checking's only function anymore. Managing your own tolerance for not having a fixed answer may be doing at least as much work as anything you're actually learning about them. Some psychologists describe a general tendency in certain people toward what's sometimes called intolerance of uncertainty, a lower threshold for sitting inside an ambiguous situation without resolving it, even when resolving it isn't actually possible yet, and even when the ambiguity itself is fairly minor. If that tendency is present, an unclear signal from another person, a short reply, a flat tone, a distracted glance, doesn't register as neutral. It registers as an open loop. And open loops, when uncertainty is especially difficult to tolerate, may function less like ordinary curiosity and more like something closer to friction, a small, persistent pressure to close the gap, right now, by any means available. Checking is one of the fastest ways to feel like you're closing it, even when nothing about the situation has actually changed. There's a possible mechanical reason this kind of checking can be so hard to let go of, and it may have less to do with the other person than with what checking does to the feeling in your own chest. For some forms of repetitive checking, short-term relief can reinforce the behavior, a spike of discomfort beforehand, a small drop afterward, even when nothing has actually been resolved, can be enough to keep a behavior going. If interpersonal monitoring sometimes works the same way, the payoff may not be new information at all, but a brief reduction in uncertainty, the feeling of having done something rather than an actual answer. Whether that's the exact mechanism behind any one person's checking is a separate question. What tends to hold up is simpler. The relief, when it comes, is usually about the discomfort easing, not about the underlying uncertainty actually resolving. There's a philosophical version of this same tension from a very different direction. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about what he called the look, le regard, the specific experience of becoming aware that another person can see you, and in being seen, becoming an object in someone else's field of judgment, not just a subject moving through your own. For Sartre, this awareness was often described in terms of shame or self-consciousness, the sense that you are no longer simply yourself, but a version of yourself as filtered through another person's perception. Sartre's own example makes this stranger than it first sounds. In his account, a man crouched at a keyhole hears footsteps in the hallway behind him, and in that instant, shame arrives. He becomes, to himself, an object under someone else's judgment before he's even turned around to confirm anyone is actually there. Sartre goes on to consider that the footsteps might have been a false alarm, that no one was in the hallway at all, and the reorganizing force of the look had already done its work regardless. Being seen, in other words, doesn't wait for the observer to be confirmed. The experience can arrive on suspicion alone, and it can restructure how you relate to yourself before any actual gaze has landed. What's happening in the checking pattern draws on that same territory, but stretches it into something ongoing rather than a single moment in a hallway. In a sense, you become the one doing the watching and the one imagining being watched at the same time, in the same head, repeatedly inferring another person's possible evaluation or emotional state from signals that stay genuinely ambiguous. A short reply, a flat tone, sometimes checked and rechecked without any new information actually arriving in between. Sartre isolates a sudden, bounded episode, a single occasion where the possibility of being seen lands, and shame arrives whether or not the observer turns out to be real. Interpersonal checking doesn't have that same shape. What's being inferred, another person's emotional or evaluative state, has no equivalent single moment in which it has to reveal itself completely. There's no hallway to turn and face, no fixed point where the ambiguity is required to declare itself one way or the other, because an inner state doesn't announce its own resolution the way a set of footsteps might. It's worth being honest about where this shades into something ordinary and useful, and where it starts to cross into something else. Reading a room is a real skill. Noticing when someone's tone has shifted, adjusting how you speak next, softening something that landed badly, none of that is the problem. Social awareness at a reasonable level keeps relationships working. The line isn't crossed by noticing, it's crossed somewhere around repetition without resolution. When noticing turns into rechecking the same signal multiple times without new information, when the checking continues after a clear answer has already been given, when it starts happening before any signal has appeared at all, purely on the possibility that one might. Picture the difference side by side. Someone sends a one-word reply, and you notice it. Register that it's a little short, and move on with your day. That's the useful version, doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Someone sends the same one-word reply, and 20 minutes later you're still holding your phone, rereading it, drafting and deleting 3 different follow-up messages, running through a list of things you might have said wrong in the last conversation. Same input, but the process no longer resembles noticing. It resembles an investigation that keeps reopening itself past the point where new evidence is actually available. Whatever information gathering started it, something else may now be sustaining it. A pull toward the feeling of being finished, a feeling that keeps refusing to arrive, no matter how many times the same evidence gets reread. And once that threshold is crossed, something subtle can start happening to the checking itself. It doesn't necessarily stop functioning as information gathering, but it can start doing something else at the same time, operating as a kind of behavior that lowers the discomfort of not knowing, closer to a habit than a pure strategy. The reason it can look almost identical to genuine attentiveness from the outside is that it uses the exact same tools: watching a face, rereading a message, listening for a shift in tone. What may have changed isn't the tool, but how much of the behavior's weight is being carried by each function, understanding the other person, and regulating the discomfort of not knowing, using another person's face as the instrument for both. This may be part of why the checking doesn't always produce the relief it seems to be chasing. Information can end a search that's purely about finding out what's true. But when uncertainty regulation is also part of what's driving the behavior, an external answer may not be able to fully close the loop on its own, because part of what's being managed is a felt state that has to be tolerated as much as solved. You can get someone to say, directly and sincerely, "I'm not upset with you," and still feel the itch to check again later, not necessarily because you doubt them, but because at least part of the itch may never have been entirely about them to begin with. There's also a cost to this that's easy to miss, because it doesn't look like a cost from the inside. Every time attention gets pulled toward monitoring someone else's state, it leaves the actual moment you're in. You're not fully in the conversation, you're half in it, and half running a background check on it. You're not fully doing whatever you were doing before the message came in. Some part of you is holding the phone, or holding the question, even after you've set both down. The vigilance doesn't announce itself as absence, it feels like care. But it functions a lot of the time as a kind of low-grade withdrawal from the present in favor of scanning for a future that hasn't happened yet. It shows up in smaller ways than people usually expect too, not always as a dramatic spiral, but as a kind of tax on ordinary moments. A meal where half your attention is on whether the silence across the table means anything. An email you reread for the 4th time before sending. not because the wording is unclear, but because you're trying to predict how the other person's mood will receive it. A walk you take with someone where you remember, afterward, almost nothing about what you actually saw, because most of the walk was spent quietly reading their face. None of these moments look like a crisis from the outside. That's part of what makes the pattern so easy to live inside for years without naming it. It rarely interrupts anything loudly enough to be noticed as its own event. It just quietly takes a cut of your attention, conversation after conversation, and gives almost nothing back in exchange. None of this means the checking is irrational, or that it comes from nowhere, or that it says something broken about the person doing it. Attention that stays alert to other people's moods can develop for all sorts of reasons, and this isn't the place to assign one cause to every version of it. That would be a much more specific claim than the pattern itself can support. It also isn't the same thing as a clinical anxiety condition, and treating every instance of it as evidence of one would flatten something that for a lot of people is simply a habit of attention rather than a diagnosis. What can be said more carefully is this: the checking behavior, examined on its own terms, functions less like protection against an actual threat and more like a private negotiation with uncertainty, one that borrows another person's face as its evidence, whether or not that person has actually changed anything about how they feel. It's also worth noticing what the behavior quietly assumes about other people, because the assumption rarely gets examined directly. Constant checking treats another person's emotional state as something unstable enough to require monitoring, as if a mood, once observed as fine, could silently curdle in the next 10 minutes without warning. The checking behaves as though that's true, as though the other person's state is volatile enough to need continuous tracking, but the checking itself has no way of actually establishing whether that assumption holds. It isn't calibrated by evidence of how volatile the other person really is. It's calibrated by how much uncertainty the person doing the checking can personally stand to carry. The question can now be reframed. Less: why do you keep checking if everyone is upset with you? More: what happens when not knowing becomes the part you can't sit inside and checking becomes the way that gets managed? This reframing doesn't make the checking disappear, and it isn't offered here as a fix. What it does is relocate the actual question underneath the behavior. The question the checking seems to be asking, "Are they upset with me?" may never get a fully reliable answer from watching alone. Faces and tones are thin evidence at the best of times, and a mind determined to find a warning sign can usually find one, whether or not it's actually there. The harder question sitting underneath it isn't about them at all, whether an unresolved state can simply remain unresolved without being converted again and again into something to check. Argus never gets to rest in the story until someone else brings that rest to him, until the watching finally gives out eye by eye and the long vigil comes to its end. What happens next isn't a neutral ending. In Ovid's telling, Hera sets Argus's eyes into the feathers of her bird, then turns her anger back toward Io, whose ordeal continues. But one detail outlasts the rest: the eyes themselves, set into the peacock's tail, watching nothing now, kept only for how they look. Read symbolically, and only symbolically, that ending suggests something worth sitting with. Watching can outlast the point where more watching is actually capable of resolving anything. The eyes are still there, they've just stopped being useful for seeing.